Natalie Telis and Emily Glassberg are here right now, presenters here at the meeting. Very excited about your presentation, I know, passionate about it. Explain a little bit.
So we have a few key findings, the first of which is sort of about gender representation here at the meeting. So we wanted to know who actually attends the meeting and who presents here. So the first thing we found in looking through the abstract books and doing this very data-driven classification of who is here and who presents what topic, we found there's just really high variance in the number of men and women who present in each subfield of human genetics. So LC, genetic counseling, are very female-biased fields. Bioinformatics, omics technologies are very male-biased fields. We also noticed that within each session, there's a bias in who gets talks versus who gets posters. So it turns out more women present posters than present talks.
But in terms of collecting your data, sometimes the questions even have a little bit of bias.
Right, exactly. So a lot of the purpose of collecting demographic information was so we had an idea of who was here to be in the audience, participating and asking questions. And so what we find overall is that women participate a lot less than men. So for instance, although we'd expect a lot of sessions kind of across the meeting to be something like 50-50, male-female, women make up a much smaller fraction of the questions, more like 30%. And so we see a lot of underrepresentation. It's really interesting because this result replicates in several different contexts, both in plenary meetings and in smaller meetings. A second really interesting finding that we have is that women prefer to ask women questions, even when controlling for the fact that there aren't the same number of female speakers at each session. But symmetrically, men prefer to ask men questions. We think of questions as this really interesting barometer for comfort and confidence in a room, and finding that symmetric preference tells us a lot about what might make people comfortable and identifying with the speaker. And then finally, we learn a lot about how people interact with the presenter. So we find that follow-up questions, when someone asks a question and then they ask another question, are male biased, and both challenge questions, so kind of hostile challenges of the methods, and compliments are male biased because it turns out they often coincide. So a lot of questions are like, oh, thanks for the great talk. Was everything you said awful?
Well, when you're looking at all of this and you think, okay, now what do I do with it? How can we have some improvements here based on what we found?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question. And it's important to remember that we're not trying to pathologize question asking. It's not like, oh, if you're a woman, you need to stand up and ask another question. It's more just like, this is a strange observation. We were sitting at this meeting and we felt like not enough women were asking questions. And we're scientists, we're bioinformaticians, and so we thought, let's put some data behind this, let's actually figure out what's going on and see if it's something that we need to address and what we might do about it.
And to some extent, a lot of our conversation isn't data-driven in a way that it could be. Like, for instance, we say a lot of things about how if we could just bring the number of women in the room up, like if we just got to 50%, then suddenly women and men would participate in all the exact same ways. And what's really cool is that we have the power to test this hypothesis. So we actually look at question asking within those genetic counseling and LC sessions where we expect with our computational modeling that the proportion of female attendees is going to be near 70%. But the proportion of questions from women barely breaks 45%. We actually estimate we would need an audience of about 85% women in order to get it to 50%.
But knowledge is power. So now that you put this information out here, do you see it changing behaviors? If I know, boy, not a lot of women ask questions, maybe I'm going to think about raising my hand and asking a question.
Right. I think this is a lot of what we're interested in, and one of the reasons that we're trying to crowdsource data collection here at ASHG to understand how speaking to the entire meeting and trying to publicize the trends that we find might shape the way that people kind of introspect and think about their behaviors.
And let's talk about why that is so important, the gender diversity.
Yeah, so it's really hard to put your finger on what drives differences in male and female participation in science. It's just really sort of slippery, and we've had a lot of women come up and talk to us about this project and say, oh, that's exactly what I experienced. Oh, I've like sort of been feeling this way for a while. So I think it's that response has really said to us that we're doing something important. We're representing people's experiences, and we're like sort of opening up this as a space that people can talk about how we need to do better and how men and women can equally participate and have equal pathways to success in our own field.
a lot of what is so challenging when we talk about diversity is that sometimes we don't actually have a quantitative picture of what's going on in a space. So for instance, when we looked at the meeting overall, we saw that indeed overall actually the proportion of female presenters versus male presenters is really close to 50-50. It's actually only by diving in and trying to get at some of these more nuanced subtleties that we can actually find out what's going on here. And I think without quantifying it, we don't have the power to even start thinking about addressing it.
Do you ever think about backing it up? I know a lot of people say going into middle school and high school, there are very few women in STEM careers because of the encouragement or lack thereof of getting into it. Have you ever thought about expanding your area of research?
So actually, there's a lot of sociology research on question asking, particularly in the classroom in more middle and high school settings. So that's definitely an inspiration for our work. It sort of seems like differences in question asking might start young and might start to have effects on perception of who might be experts. It seems like that starts really early, so maybe we're just seeing ripple effects of that here at the meeting.
And part of the reason that we started here is because we're both bioinformaticians, computational biologists, so we come here and this is really our own space. In addition to that, ASHG has actually been super collaborative and has helped us back up our computational methods for inferring gender by giving us some of the data that they've collected about these proportions as well. So to some extent, choosing ASHG was a matter of circumstance. I don't find myself in middle schools very often as a graduate student. I don't know about you.
But it's important information nonetheless. Thank you so much, ladies.
Yeah.